Something inside Buckingham Palace isn't just shifting anymore. It feels like it's cracking open, and what's coming out isn't pretty at all. Royal watchers are quietly admitting that the family is facing a serious internal crisis, one that goes deeper than anything the public has fully seen. At the center of it all sits a figure most people never expected to become this important: Camilla's son, Tom Parker Bowles, who has now been pushed out of the royal circle in a way that feels sudden on the surface but has actually been building for years. The trigger, according to those close to the situation, was a discovery made by Princess Anne, something disturbing enough that it shook the palace at its core. And while people outside may still be trying to understand what's really happening, inside those walls the reaction has already unfolded. There's a sense that something irreversible has taken place. Camilla, meanwhile, is said to be trying to contain the fallout, moving quickly, almost desperately, to stop things from spiraling further, but timing is not on her side. Because what's unfolding now isn't just another manageable controversy. It's something heavier, something darker, something that carries a finality she may not be able to undo. What makes it even more painful is the position she's in, because this situation revolves around someone she could never fully bring into her new world, no matter how much she may have wanted to. When Camilla became queen, it was a moment the world watched and judged in equal measure. But while the public focused on the crown placed on her head, something else was happening quietly behind the scenes. A line was being drawn, and a door was being closed, permanently. Tom understood that moment in a way few others could. As he watched his mother rise to the highest position, he also realized that her elevation did not extend to him. The crown would not shield him, would not carry him forward, and would not protect him from what was coming. And the person who played a key role in making sure of that was Princess Anne, who had not just suddenly reacted, but had been observing, collecting, and building a case against Tom over many years. This wasn't impulsive. It was patient, methodical, and rooted in a long memory of things that, in her eyes, could not simply be ignored or forgiven. That record didn't begin in recent years. It went all the way back to one of the most painful chapters of Tom's life. As a teenager, he watched his family fall apart in full public view, with a level of exposure and humiliation that few people could truly understand. His father, Andrew Parker Bowles, a respected and dignified military figure, was publicly dragged into one of the most talked-about betrayals in modern royal history. It played out in front of millions, and Tom had no escape from it. He couldn't outrun the identity that was stamped onto him in that moment, Camilla's son, and at the time, that label came with a heavy weight, because his mother was deeply unpopular across Britain. That early wound shaped everything that followed. But it didn't end there. Years later, in 1999, Tom found himself at the center of a scandal that nearly destroyed what his mother had been slowly trying to rebuild. In what many saw as a reckless and damaging mistake, he was caught in a sting operation involving a journalist posing as a wealthy figure, and the recorded conversation that followed caused a media explosion. The allegations of drug involvement spread rapidly, and although he was formally cautioned rather than charged, the damage was already done. The story didn't just affect him, it cast a shadow over Camilla at a time when she could least afford it. And according to those who understand how the palace works, that moment was never truly forgotten. It was recorded, stored, and quietly carried forward into every decision that came after. Even as the public moved on, the institution did not. That history stayed in the background, shaping how Tom was seen and how far he would ever be allowed to go within royal proximity. Now, years later, with Camilla as queen, the contrast between her position and Tom's reality has become impossible to ignore. She stands at the center of power, present at the most formal state occasions, her role fully recognized and established. But Tom remains completely outside that structure. No official role, no royal title, no public funding, nothing that would tie him formally to the institution his mother now represents. Instead, he built his own career as a food critic and media personality, working independently without the protection or privileges many might assume would come naturally with his background. And that gap, that clear separation between mother and son, wasn't accidental. It was the result of deliberate decisions made over time by people who were determined to keep that boundary in place. And as questions began to surface about who had enforced that line so consistently, attention kept returning to one person, Princess Anne. Because she had been watching closely, for longer than most realized, and what she saw only strengthened her belief that the line should never be crossed. To really understand why Princess Anne took such a firm and unyielding stance when it came to Tom, you have to look at how she viewed his mother from the very beginning, because the distance didn't start with him. It started long before, with Camilla, and it never truly softened over time. Even when Camilla was gradually accepted into the royal family, that acceptance came without warmth, without trust, and certainly without any sense of emotional closeness from Anne. Royal biographers like Penny Junor and Robert Lacey have both pointed out that Anne was among the last senior royals to accept Camilla's presence, and even then, it was more of a formal acknowledgement than genuine approval. Early on, Camilla tried to build bridges in the ways people often do in those situations, sending flowers, gifts, small gestures meant to open a door. But one moment, often repeated in royal circles, captured Anne's mindset perfectly. When a delivery arrived with a handwritten note from Camilla, and reportedly didn't even open it. She simply looked at it and instructed her staff to throw it away, making it clear in a calm but cutting way that she saw no value in anything coming from someone she believed had caused deep damage to the institution. That reaction wasn't loud or dramatic. It was controlled, precise, and rooted in a belief that what had happened in the past could not just be brushed aside. And has always operated on a very strict principle, one she applies to herself every single day without exception, that a place within the royal family must be earned through years of visible service, sacrifice, and unwavering duty. In her eyes, there are no shortcuts, no side doors, and no exceptions based on personal relationships. You don't arrive because of love, you arrive because you've proven your commitment over decades, often without recognition or reward. And by that standard, she never believed Camilla had earned her place in the same way others had. She accepted the reality because the decision was ultimately beyond her control, but she never lowered her guard, and that same guarded distance extended naturally to Tom. Over the years, as Tom built a successful career as a writer, food critic, and television personality, and watched closely, and what she saw didn't sit well with her at all. On the surface, everything about his career looked legitimate. Major publications, book deals, television appearances. But from Anne's perspective, there was always one underlying factor doing most of the work, his connection to Camilla. That connection, in her view, opened doors that would have remained firmly closed to someone without royal ties. It placed him in rooms, conversations, and opportunities that were not easily accessible, and she believed that influence was being used without being properly earned. For someone like Anne, who had spent decades carrying out official duties, representing the crown, and building her standing through consistent effort, that contrast was difficult to ignore. To her, the royal name carries weight because of the responsibility attached to it, because of the years of service behind it, and because of the expectations it demands. And Tom, in her assessment, had not contributed to that weight in any meaningful way. He had simply been born close enough to benefit from it. That perception alone created tension, but things became more serious when Tom began speaking publicly about the royal family. In interviews and appearances, he occasionally shared opinions about the institution, sometimes in ways that suggested a level of authority or insight that the palace had never officially granted him. No one had positioned him as a spokesperson, and yet his comments could easily be interpreted that way by the public. At times, those comments even carried a critical tone towards certain figures in positions of power, which raised further concern. There were also quiet reports circulating within certain circles about remarks he had allegedly made in private, comments about senior royals that, if ever made public, could cause real damage. Whether those reports were exaggerated or not, the mere possibility was enough to raise alarms. For Anne, this wasn't just about personal opinion or individual behavior, it was about risk to the institution itself. She began asking a very direct question behind closed doors. If Tom were to say something publicly that sparked controversy, or if his actions created a situation the palace wasn't prepared to handle, would they be able to contain the fallout? And the uncomfortable truth was that they already knew the answer, because they had been through something similar before. The 1999 incident had already shown how quickly things could escalate, how one situation could turn into a full-blown crisis that required significant effort to manage behind the scenes. From Anne's perspective, the fact that it had been handled once didn't mean the risk was gone, it simply meant they had been fortunate that time. And relying on luck, in her view, was not a strategy for protecting something as fragile and important as the monarchy. Over the years, she had quietly gathered every detail, every concern, every incident that supported her position, building a case that was not emotional or reactive, but structured and deliberate. And eventually, she reached a point where she believed it could no longer remain unspoken. She had everything she needed, and she was ready to bring it forward, not as a personal complaint, but as a matter of duty, something that, once presented, would be difficult for anyone in the room to ignore or dismiss. When Princess Anne finally decided to act, she didn't do it impulsively or emotionally. She chose her moment carefully and requested a private meeting with senior figures inside the royal household, the kind of room where decisions are not just discussed but quietly set into motion. And when she sat down, she didn't ease into the conversation or soften her words. She went straight to the point with a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. She laid out the reality as she saw it. Tom had no official title, no defined role, and no formal authority within the institution, yet he continued to speak publicly in ways that could easily be perceived as representing the royal family. That, in her view, was a problem the palace had allowed to exist for far too long. Every sentence she delivered carried weight, not because of how loud it was, but because of how precise and controlled it felt. She made it clear that this wasn't about personal dislike or family tension, and that was exactly what made it so difficult to challenge. She wasn't speaking as a relative, she was speaking as a senior working royal with decades of service behind her, someone whose entire public life had been built on duty. That distinction changed everything, because it meant her argument couldn't be dismissed as emotional or biased. It had to be addressed on its merits. Then she brought forward something that shifted the atmosphere in the room completely, the 1999 drug incident. She didn't present it as gossip or history that had already passed. She treated it as an unresolved issue, something that had been buried rather than dealt with, and she made it clear that ignoring it again would be a conscious decision, one that everyone in that room would share responsibility for. By framing it that way, she removed any comfortable distance from the situation. It was no longer about what had happened years ago, it was about what they were choosing to do now. And the room, according to those familiar with how these meetings unfold, had no easy response to that. Because pushing back against her argument would have required questioning the very principles the institution claims to stand for: duty, accountability, and protection of its own stability. And hadn't come to express frustration. She had come to make it impossible for the issue to be ignored any longer. And in that, she succeeded. But what followed inside that room carried a different kind of weight, one that was far more personal and far more difficult to process. The most significant reaction didn't come from King Charles, and it didn't come from Prince William either. It came from Camilla, but not through words, not through defense, not even through visible opposition. It came through silence. And that silence spoke louder than anything else could have. Because Camilla found herself in a position where every possible response carried a cost she simply could not afford. If she had stepped forward to defend her son openly, it would have risked undermining the very argument she had spent years building, that she deserved her place because of her commitment to duty above all else. Supporting Tom publicly in that moment could have been seen as placing personal loyalty above institutional responsibility, and that perception alone could have undone much of what she had fought to establish. On the other hand, challenging and directly would have created a visible divide at the highest level of the royal family, something that would inevitably leak beyond palace walls and feed a narrative of internal conflict. Headlines would have focused not just on disagreement, but on instability, dragging past controversies back into public conversation and reopening wounds that had never fully healed. Camilla understood that risk better than anyone. She knew how quickly perception could turn, how fragile acceptance could be, and how easily years of careful positioning could unravel. So she remained still, outwardly composed, even as the tension in the room built around her. There are accounts that describe small details from that moment, subtle movements, controlled gestures, that revealed just how much she was holding back. Because the truth is, this wasn't a sudden realization for her. Long before this meeting ever took place, she had already begun creating distance between her role and her son's proximity to it. Quietly, deliberately, she had limited how closely he could be associated with the institution, not because she didn't care, but because she understood the implications of not doing so. She had seen the risks, weighed the consequences, and made a decision privately that the crown had to come first. That choice, once made, couldn't be undone without reopening everything she had worked to stabilize. And now, sitting in that room, she was faced with the public version of a decision she had already made in private. There was no move left that wouldn't carry consequences, and in the end, the only option she had was to say nothing at all. That silence allowed the conversation to move forward without resistance, and once it did, the focus shifted from whether action should be taken to who would ultimately enforce it. Because at that level, once a problem is acknowledged in that way, it doesn't remain unresolved for long. It moves upward, toward the person with the authority to make it final. And in this case, there was only one figure whose judgment would carry that kind of weight moving forward. As the situation moved beyond that room and into the hands of someone with the authority to make it final, the focus shifted toward Prince William, because the reality inside the palace had already begun to change in ways the public could only partially see. With King Charles facing serious health concerns, including his cancer diagnosis, there was a gradual but undeniable shift in how decisions were being handled behind the scenes. Responsibilities weren't just being shared, they were being quietly transferred, especially when it came to defining who truly belonged within the structure of the monarchy and who remained outside of it. And when it comes to that question, William's position has always been remarkably clear, almost to the point of being unbending. Those who have observed him closely describe his approach as structured, disciplined, and intentionally narrow. In his view, the monarchy is not something flexible or open-ended. It's a carefully protected institution with defined boundaries that cannot be blurred without consequences. You are either inside that structure as a working royal, committed to public duty and service, or you are outside of it entirely. There is very little space in between. This mindset has shaped many of his decisions over the years, including the well-documented tensions with Prince Harry and Meghan Markle when their roles began to move into uncertain territory between royal and non-royal life. William resisted that ambiguity strongly, because to him, allowing those lines to soften would weaken the clarity and authority the institution depends on. That same perspective now applied directly to Tom Parker Bowles. When measured against the standards William consistently upholds, Tom simply did not fit within the framework of what the monarchy represents. He held no official position, carried no defined responsibility, and had no formal role that connected him to the duties expected of those inside the institution. From William's standpoint, that alone placed him outside the boundary, and once that boundary is defined, it is not easily adjusted. What Princess Anne had done through her careful and methodical presentation was provide something William could use, a formal justification that aligned perfectly with a position he had already formed independently. It wasn't that Anne changed his mind, it was that she gave structure and institutional backing to a conclusion he had already reached. And once that alignment was in place, the next steps didn't take long to unfold. There was no dramatic announcement, no public statement, no moment that clearly marked the decision as official. Instead, the process followed a pattern that the palace has used many times before when handling sensitive situations: quiet, controlled, and deliberately untraceable. The intention wasn't just to make a decision, it was to make that decision impossible to challenge. Because if nothing is formally declared, then nothing can be formally disputed. And that is exactly how it happened. Tom was never called into a room and told directly that he was being excluded. No document was placed in front of him, no explanation was offered, and no timeline was given. Instead, the changes began to appear gradually, almost subtly at first. Invitations that would have once arrived without question simply stopped coming. Events he might have expected to attend moved forward without his name included, and there was no acknowledgement that anything had changed. People who had once interacted with him easily and naturally began to shift their tone. Conversations became more formal, more distant, less frequent. Doors that had once opened with little effort started to remain closed, regardless of how he approached them. And while each individual change might have seemed small on its own, together they formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. Tom is not someone unfamiliar with how the system works, and he didn't need an official statement to understand what was happening. He could see the outline of the decision clearly, even if no one ever confirmed it out loud. And perhaps the most difficult part of it all was that he had no real way to respond. Because in a situation like this, speaking publicly doesn't solve the problem. It creates a new one. If he were to give an interview, to describe what he believed had been done to him, the focus would immediately shift. The narrative wouldn't center on his exclusion, it would center on him becoming a source of controversy. Headlines would frame it as the Queen's son creating tension for the palace, and every past issue, from the 1999 incident to any rumor that had ever circulated, would be brought back into the spotlight almost instantly. The institution has both the memory and the reach to defend itself, and in that kind of conflict, the outcome would be predictable. It wouldn't just affect Tom, it would reflect directly on Camilla. Every statement he made would raise questions about her judgment, her position, and her ability to separate personal loyalty from public duty. And that is a burden he understands all too well. So instead of reacting, he adjusts. He continues with his work, writing, appearing, maintaining the routine he built independently over the years. When he is present at events, he follows the unspoken rules, standing where he is expected to stand, stepping back when required, never pushing beyond what is permitted. From the outside, it might appear calm, almost as if nothing has changed. But beneath that surface, there is a clear awareness of the boundaries now in place. Reports even suggest that in at least one encounter, William made those boundaries unmistakably clear in person, delivering a quiet but direct warning that left no room for interpretation. Whether those accounts are fully accurate or not, the effect is the same. Tom understands the limits, and he chooses not to cross them. Not because he agrees with everything that has happened, but because he recognizes what is at stake if he does. This is not just about his own position anymore. Any move he makes could ripple outward and impact the person at the center of it all, his mother. And that is a risk he is not willing to take. He has seen how the institution deals with situations it considers problematic, how quickly and completely it can distance itself when necessary. And he knows that if things were to escalate, the consequences would not be contained to him alone. That understanding shapes his choices now, keeping him measured, controlled, and very careful about every step he takes moving forward. And this is where everything settles into something far more unsettling than any public drama, because what's happening to Tom isn't loud, it isn't explosive, it's controlled, quiet, and incredibly precise, the kind of distancing that doesn't leave fingerprints but still changes everything. From the outside, his life still looks intact. He continues writing, appearing on television, maintaining the career he built with his own effort over the years. There are no dramatic headlines announcing a fall, no official statements confirming a break, nothing that clearly signals what has actually taken place. But inside that silence, the reality is very different. The access he once had is gone. The ease, the familiarity, the unspoken inclusion, none of it exists anymore in the way it once did. And the most difficult part is that this kind of exclusion gives him nothing solid to push against. There's no decision he can formally challenge, no statement he can deny, no action he can publicly respond to. It's a removal without a moment, a shift without a clear beginning or end, and that makes it almost impossible to confront. Because the moment he tries to speak about it, the entire situation flips. It stops being about what was done to him and starts becoming about what he is doing to the palace. That's how the system protects itself. It turns reaction into risk. If Tom were to sit down and explain his side, to describe the gradual closing of doors, the sudden absence of invitations, the change in how people treat him, it wouldn't land as a personal account seeking clarity. It would be framed as disruption. It would immediately pull the institution into a defensive position, and in doing so, it would trigger a response designed to contain and redirect the narrative. Every past controversy would resurface, every mistake would be re-examined, every rumor would be given new life. The 1999 incident would not be history anymore. It would be context. And in that context, Tom wouldn't be seen as someone affected by a decision. He would be seen as someone creating a problem. That distinction matters more than anything else, because once it shifts, the outcome becomes almost predictable. The palace doesn't engage in open conflict unless it absolutely has to, but when it does so with a level of coordination and control that few can match. And Tom understands that. He understands that speaking out doesn't just risk his own reputation, it directly impacts Camilla. Every word he says would be tied back to her, every headline would include her name, every question would circle around her position and her judgment. It wouldn't take long for the focus to move away from him entirely and land squarely on her shoulders. That's the pressure point in all of this, the one thing that keeps him from reacting in a way many people might expect. Because whatever frustration or anger he might feel, he knows that expressing it publicly would place her in an impossible situation, forcing her to respond in a way that could damage everything she has worked to secure. And that is something he avoids at all costs. So instead, he does what he has been doing for years. He stays within the boundaries that have been set, even if those boundaries were never officially explained to him. He continues his work, maintains his presence, and adapts to the new reality without acknowledging it directly. It's a form of quiet compliance, not because he agrees with the outcome, but because he recognizes the consequences of resisting it. There's also an awareness that goes beyond just understanding the rules. There's an understanding of how far those rules can be enforced if necessary. He has seen, from a distance and sometimes up close, how the institution deals with individuals who become difficult to manage, how quickly narratives can be shaped, how thoroughly distance can be created. And that awareness creates a kind of restraint that isn't imposed from the outside, it comes from within. He knows what could happen if things escalate, and that knowledge keeps him careful, measured, and deliberately still. Even in moments where he might feel the urge to push back, to question, to respond, that calculation is always there in the background. Because this isn't just about personal pride or fairness, it's about understanding the scale of what he's dealing with. The monarchy is not just a family, it's an institution with a long memory and a very clear sense of self-preservation. And when it decides to draw a line, it does so in a way that is meant to hold. Tom has reached that line, and he knows it. The space he occupies now is defined not by what he is allowed to do, but by what he chooses not to do. And in that choice, there's a kind of quiet tension that never fully goes away. It follows him through every public appearance, every interview, every moment where the question might come up but doesn't. Because the silence isn't empty, it's active, it's deliberate, and it's carrying more weight than anything he could say out loud. And over time, that silence doesn't just stay on the surface. It starts shaping everything underneath it, changing how Tom sees his place in a world he was once so close to but was never fully allowed to enter. Because what makes this situation especially difficult is that it isn't built on a single moment of rejection. It's built on years of slow separation, small signals that gradually formed a clear message without ever needing to be spoken directly. At no point was there a dramatic confrontation, no final conversation where everything was laid out in the open. Instead, it unfolded in fragments, missed invitations, altered interactions, subtle shifts in tone that only someone paying close attention would fully notice. And Tom has always been paying attention. He understands environments like this, understands how decisions are communicated without words, how distance can be created without acknowledgement. That awareness means he doesn't need confirmation to know where he stands. But knowing doesn't make it easier to accept. Because there's a difference between understanding something intellectually and living with it day after day, especially when it involves people and places that were once familiar, once accessible, once part of your normal reality. Now, everything exists at a slight remove, close enough to see but not close enough to touch. And that kind of proximity without belonging creates its own kind of pressure. It's not explosive, it doesn't demand attention, but it lingers, quietly influencing how he moves, how he speaks, how he chooses to engage with anything even remotely connected to the institution. There's a constant calculation happening in the background. What to say, what not to say, where to appear, where to step back. Not because anyone is giving him direct instructions, but because the pattern has already been set, and he knows what happens when those patterns are ignored. Over time, that kind of awareness becomes instinctive. It shapes behavior without needing conscious effort. And in many ways, that's exactly how the system is designed to work. It doesn't rely on enforcement alone, it relies on understanding, on the idea that once someone recognizes the boundaries, they will adjust themselves accordingly. Tom has done exactly that. He hasn't challenged the situation publicly, hasn't tried to push his way back into spaces that have clearly been closed to him. Instead, he has adapted, building a version of his life that exists alongside the institution rather than within it. His work continues, his public presence remains steady, and on the surface, everything appears balanced. But that balance comes with a cost, one that isn't always visible but is always there. Because no matter how independent his career may be, no matter how separate his public identity becomes, the connection to his mother, and by extension, to the monarchy, never fully disappears. It's part of how people see him, part of how he is introduced, part of the context that follows him into every room. And yet, at the same time, that connection is something he has to keep at a distance, something he cannot lean on or fully acknowledge without risking consequences. That contradiction is at the center of everything. He is both connected and excluded, recognized and restricted, visible but carefully contained. And navigating that space requires a level of control that most people never have to develop. It means constantly balancing personal identity against public perception, making choices not just based on what he wants to do, but on what those choices might represent to others watching from the outside. Because even now, there's an understanding that he is still being observed, still being measured against a standard he was never officially part of, but is still expected to respect. That sense of being watched doesn't have to be confirmed, it's something that comes with proximity to an institution like this. And whether those reports about direct warnings are fully accurate or not, the effect remains the same. Tom moves carefully because he knows the consequences of not doing so. He has seen what happens when individuals are perceived as stepping out of line, how quickly narratives can shift, how decisively distance can be enforced. And more importantly, he knows that any misstep wouldn't just affect him, it would circle back to Camilla. That connection is what anchors his decisions more than anything else. Whatever frustration or disappointment he may carry, it is balanced against a very clear understanding of what is at stake. Because in the end, this isn't just about access or recognition, it's about protecting something far larger than himself. And that awareness shapes everything, keeping him steady, controlled, and firmly within the limits that have been set, even if those limits were never spoken out loud. And as time goes on, that careful control starts to look less like a temporary adjustment and more like a permanent reality that Tom has no choice but to live with. Because in situations like this, the longer something continues without being challenged, the more it becomes the accepted structure, the new normal that quietly replaces what came before. The invitations don't just stop once, they stay stopped. The distance doesn't fluctuate, it settles in and holds. And eventually, even the people around him begin to behave as if this is simply how things are meant to be. Conversations shift, expectations adjust, and what once felt unusual slowly becomes routine. That is how exclusion solidifies, not through force, but through consistency. And Tom can see that happening in real time. He can feel the difference between what used to be open to him and what is now firmly out of reach. And he understands that this isn't something that will correct itself with time. If anything, time is what makes it stronger, more difficult to reverse, more deeply embedded into the way the institution operates around him. That realization carries its own weight, because it removes any illusion that this might just be a phase or a temporary response to a specific concern. It isn't. It's a direction, a decision that continues to reinforce itself with every passing day. And yet, despite that clarity, he doesn't push against it. Not publicly, not privately in any way that would create visible friction. Instead, he continues to move forward in a way that respects the boundaries, even when those boundaries limit him. He focuses on what remains within his control, his work, his public image, the life he has built independently of the palace. There's a discipline in that approach, a willingness to accept the situation for what it is rather than what it could have been. But acceptance doesn't mean agreement, and it certainly doesn't mean the absence of emotion. It just means that whatever he feels, he keeps it contained. Because expressing it in the wrong way, at the wrong time, could shift everything again, and not in his favor. There's also an understanding that the people who set these boundaries are not likely to revisit them. The system doesn't operate on reconsideration once a line has been drawn this clearly. It operates on stability, on maintaining the decisions that protect its structure, even if those decisions come at a personal cost to individuals connected to it. And in this case, that cost is being carried quietly, without acknowledgement, without resolution. Tom's position has become defined not by what he has done recently, but by what the institution has decided he represents. And once that definition is in place, it becomes very difficult to change, no matter how much time passes or how carefully he conducts himself. Every action he takes now is filtered through that perception, measured against a standard that was set long before the current moment. That's part of what makes this so complex, because it isn't about a single mistake or a single event. It's about a pattern, a history, and a judgment that has already been made. And judgments like that, once established at that level, tend to hold. Still, he continues to navigate it with a kind of quiet awareness that shapes everything he does. He doesn't overstep, doesn't test the limits, doesn't create situations that might force a response. Instead, he maintains a steady presence, one that neither challenges nor fully aligns with the institution that surrounds him. It's a careful balance, one that requires constant attention but rarely shows itself on the surface. To anyone watching casually, nothing appears out of place. His career continues, his public appearances remain consistent, and there are no visible signs of conflict. But beneath that surface, the reality is far more controlled than it appears. Every step is measured, every decision considered, every interaction filtered through an understanding of where the boundaries lie. And perhaps the most difficult part of all is that this balance doesn't offer closure. There's no clear endpoint, no moment where the situation resolves or resets. It simply continues, holding him in a position that is defined by limitation rather than possibility. And in that space, the only real choice he has is how he responds to it. Not in words, not in public statements, but in the way he carries himself through it. So he remains steady, composed, and deliberate, moving forward without drawing attention to what has changed, even though he knows exactly how much has. And in the end, what makes this entire situation so difficult to fully grasp is not just what happened, but how completely it was allowed to settle without ever being openly acknowledged. There was no single moment where everything became official, no clear line where one phase ended and another began. Instead, it all dissolved into a quiet understanding that now governs how things operate. For Tom, that means living in a space where the answers are obvious, but never spoken, where the outcome is clear, but never confirmed. And that kind of reality leaves no room for resolution, no opportunity to confront or close the chapter in any traditional sense. It simply continues, shaping everything around it without ever stepping into the light. What remains is a situation defined by restraint, his restraint, the institution's restraint, and most of all, the restraint that exists between him and his mother. Because at the center of all of this, beyond the structure, beyond the rules, beyond the decisions made in private rooms, there is still that relationship. And it's one that now exists under a very specific kind of pressure, one that neither of them can fully escape. Camilla cannot publicly bridge the distance without risking everything she has built, and Tom cannot challenge it without putting her in a position that could undo it. So they both remain exactly where they are, connected but carefully separated, close but never fully aligned in public. That balance is fragile, but it holds, because neither of them is willing to be the one who breaks it. And that may be the most defining part of this entire story. Not the exclusion itself, not the decisions that led to it, but the way it continues to exist without confrontation. It is maintained through silence, through understanding, through choices that are made every day without being announced. Tom chooses not to speak. Camilla chooses not to intervene. The institution chooses not to explain. And together, those choices create a reality that is stable on the surface but carries a constant, underlying tension. It's the kind of tension that doesn't erupt, doesn't demand attention, but never fully disappears either. It stays present in every interaction, every appearance, every moment where the question could be asked but isn't. And over time, that silence becomes its own kind of conclusion, not a satisfying one, not a clear one, but a lasting one. Because without words, without acknowledgement, without any formal ending, this situation doesn't resolve. It simply becomes permanent. And in that permanence, Tom's position is fixed, not by what he says or does, but by what he chooses not to say, and by the boundaries he chooses not to cross. And when something like this becomes permanent, it stops feeling like a situation and starts feeling like a quiet reality that no one openly questions anymore. The absence of explanation slowly turns into acceptance, not because people fully understand it, but because nothing contradicts it. Over time, even the curiosity fades. The public sees what is presented, Tom continuing his work, appearing composed, moving through life without visible disruption, and assumes that everything is settled. But what they don't see is how much of that calm is maintained by choice, by discipline, by a constant awareness of what cannot be said or done. Because in a world like this, stability is not accidental. It is carefully protected, often at the cost of clarity. And Tom understands that better than most. He knows that the version of events that remains unspoken is often the one that holds the most weight, because it cannot be challenged or reshaped. It simply exists, untouched and untested, shaping perception from the background. That is the space he now lives in, a space where the truth, whatever it fully is, doesn't need to be confirmed to be effective. And the longer it remains unspoken, the stronger it becomes. That creates a kind of stillness that is difficult to break, because breaking it would mean introducing uncertainty, and uncertainty is exactly what the institution works hardest to avoid. So everything stays controlled. The narrative remains minimal. The focus stays on continuity, on routine, on the appearance that nothing is out of place. And in that controlled environment, Tom continues to operate carefully, never stepping beyond what has quietly been established for him. There's no room for improvisation here, no space to test limits without consequence. Every action carries meaning, every decision has potential implications, and that awareness shapes how he moves through even the smallest moments. It's not about fear in a dramatic sense, it's about understanding the system he is dealing with, recognizing how it responds, and choosing to move in a way that avoids triggering those responses. Because once a reaction begins at that level, it doesn't unfold slowly. It happens with precision, with coordination, and with a clear objective, to protect the institution above all else. And that protection doesn't rely on public confrontation. It relies on control, on shaping perception, on guiding attention in a direction that maintains stability. Tom has seen enough to know that. He has watched how situations are managed, how narratives are formed, how individuals are repositioned when necessary. And that knowledge stays with him, influencing how he handles his own position now. Even in moments where he might have an opportunity to speak, to clarify, to offer his perspective, he chooses restraint. Not because he has nothing to say, but because he understands the chain reaction it could set off. And once that reaction begins, it cannot be contained in the way people might expect. It would expand, pulling in past events, reshaping current perceptions, and placing pressure on people who are already operating within tight constraints. Most of all, it would place Camilla in a position where she would have to respond, and any response she gave would carry consequences. That is the point where everything connects: his silence, her position, the institution's stability. They are not separate pieces. They depend on each other, and disrupting one affects all of them. So the silence continues, not as a sign of weakness, but as a calculated decision that keeps everything from unraveling. It holds the structure in place, even if that structure is not entirely fair or balanced from the outside perspective. And within that structure, Tom remains exactly where he is, visible, active, but carefully contained. It is a role he never formally accepted, but one he now fully understands. And understanding it is what allows him to continue without forcing a confrontation that would ultimately cost far more than it could ever resolve. And so, what remains at the end of all this is not a clean conclusion, but a settled reality that has simply learned how to sustain itself without ever needing to be fully explained. Over time, the absence of official acknowledgement has stopped feeling like something temporary and started functioning like structure itself. No one inside the system has to say it out loud anymore for it to be understood. Tom is not part of the inner circle, and he is not expected to be. That understanding has quietly stabilized into something that guides behavior on both sides. People know how to interact with him, how far to go, and where to stop, even if no one has formally outlined those limits in writing. And that is what makes this kind of situation so enduring. It doesn't rely on enforcement that is visible, it relies on shared awareness. Tom himself has adapted to that awareness in a way that is almost invisible to outsiders. He doesn't challenge what has been set, not because he lacks awareness or confidence, but because he fully understands the consequences that come with disrupting it. Every time he steps into a public space connected to that world, there is a quiet calibration happening in the background. How he speaks, how long he stays, how closely he is positioned to anything symbolic of the institution, all of it is measured, even if no one is openly directing him. That kind of self-regulation becomes second nature over time. It stops feeling like restriction and starts feeling like routine. But underneath that routine, the structure itself remains unchanged. The boundaries are still there, even if they are not being actively enforced in a visible way. They are maintained through behavior, through expectation, through an unspoken agreement that no one needs to revisit the decision because everyone already knows what it is. And in that environment, Camilla remains in a position that is equally complex, because she exists in both worlds at once, the center of the institution and the personal history that exists outside of it. That duality creates a constant pressure point, one that never fully disappears, even when things appear calm on the surface. She cannot move too openly in one direction without affecting the other, and that limitation defines much of what she is able to do in relation to Tom. Any visible shift would not be interpreted in isolation. It would be connected back to her role, her authority, and the stability of the position she has finally secured. So even within the emotional weight of the situation, her options remain narrow, shaped by consequences that extend far beyond personal relationships. And that is why the distance persists. Not because of a single decision, and not because of one moment of conflict, but because too many layers now depend on it remaining in place. The institution has settled into it, Tom has adapted to it, and Camilla has learned how to exist within it without disrupting the balance she cannot afford to lose. What could have been a breaking point instead becomes a long-term condition, one that is managed rather than resolved. And in that management, everything continues. There is no final confrontation, no public resolution, no moment where the story closes in a traditional sense. Instead, there is continuity. A carefully maintained equilibrium where everyone involved understands the rules, even if they were never formally stated. And that is how it ends, not with change, but with structure that has become so stable it no longer needs explanation to persist.